afternoon and welcome to this episode of Bright Blue TV. I'm Phoebe Arseler-Nugget-Wakefield, Senior Researcher at Bright Blue. To discuss the topic of today's episode, tackling violence against women, we are joined by four fantastic guests. Maria Miller MP, who is former chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee, Alexandra Topping, Senior News Reporter at The Guardian, Farah Nazir, Chief Executive of the charity Women's Aid, and Yvonne Roberts, former Chief Leader Writer for The Observer and Advisor to Women in Prisons. If you are tweeting about or during the event, then please use the hashtag BrightBlueTV. And if you'd like to put your own questions to the speakers, you can do so via Slido using the link in the description of this video. We'd be really delighted to receive them. Last month marked the first anniversary of the murder of Sarah Everard, a tragic event that shocked the country, even more so when the perpetrator was found to be a serving police officer. Since then, public trust in the police has been eroded further by events including the recent Charing Cross Scandal and the report that 80% of police officers accused of domestic abuse across 41 different forces have held on to their jobs. Is that indicative of a wider culture of misogyny in the police? And what does it mean for women who go to them for help? Last year saw Labour slam the Tories' justice record by pointing to prosecution rates to say that rape has effectively been decriminalised in the UK, raising questions about whether the institutions that are supposed to protect all of us are functional, particularly for women. During the pandemic, there was also evidence that domestic violence, the majority of it committed against women by men, intensified. Measures such as lockdown saw many of us feel bored and lonely, but for those who were trapped with abusers, it was deadly. The government has released a tackling violence against women and girls strategy. Part of the strategy, particularly in terms of making virtual spaces safer for women, has been the delayed online safety bill. This year, the bill has been criticised by some third sector voices for failing to specifically reference violence against women and girls. But the bill has also been praised for measures such as the criminalisation of cyberflashing for the first time. However, while we're looking to legislation for solutions, it can feel very difficult to be optimistic, as grassroots campaigns like Everyone's Invited have shown that even schools can be toxic, violent places for young women and girls, some of whom report facing near daily harassment from their young male peers. Let's go to Maria first to get this discussion going. Maria, do you think the online safety bill is doing enough to tackle violence against women and girls? Is there more that you wish was in there? And are you expecting it to have a noticeable positive impact on women's experience in virtual spaces when it comes into force?
The online safety bill will only ever be one part of a solution to the sorts of problems that you've pointed out. It will be an important part of the solution, though, because increasingly we live not just in a real life physical world, but we live in an online world too. I believe that people expect the rules and the culture of the online and offline worlds to be the same and are disappointed when they're not. So the online safety bill gives us the first chance in the history of the internet to put in place the sort of regulation most people feel should have been in place years ago. So it puts a duty of care onto the providers to be responsible for the way in which their products are used and the way they're used, and puts in place really very heavy penalties if they're not used correctly. In terms of the link in with violence against women and girls, in the debate yesterday, there was some discussion around should there be a more explicit statement in the bill that the measures in the bill address violence against women and girls issues. I'm not sure there needs to be strategic links like that in primary legislation. After all, strategies of governments change, names of strategies change. But the elements within the bill, for example, cyberflashing being criminalised, making sure that children can't access pornography under age, are just the sorts of measures which will have a significant effect. The one element, if I can, that is completely missing and needs to be addressed within the bill is the work that the Law Commission have done around online intimate image abuse. Their proposals have been consulted upon. The final recommendation should be out in a matter of weeks, and certainly I'll be making sure that consideration, or in fact, perhaps even through amendments, we will have that issue of online intimate image abuse addressed within the online safety bill as well.
Thank you, Maria. So far, beyond the online safety bill, which Maria has just said is an important part of the solution, do you think the government is doing enough to make the UK a safer place for women and girls?
I think we've seen some really some really positive interventions, such as the VORG strategy, the domestic abuse plan, and more recently a piece of work on women's health. And yeah, I think the challenge now is to ensure that these three pieces of work now link together, that these three strategies talk to each other and women don't fall through the gaps. And that is always a concern when you have separate strategies and separate sets of people delivering them, and leadership is in different places. There is always that very real, very live concern. I think the other piece is ensuring that the sort of fine sentiments in those strategies translate to the reality on the ground. And that's where sometimes you see the gaps, for example, whether local authorities are commissioning appropriately, whether local authorities are following the guidance that's in the strategies, whether health services have enough knowledge, have enough training, and have enough funding to commission the kind of services that we're thinking about and talking about, particularly around mental health, and recognizing the importance of and the connection between mental health and violence against women, and how those two things interact, and sort of lived experience there. So I think there is a huge piece of work to ensure that the strategies work together, and that they actually trickle down to the people that need them, and that they're realised. And I guess the sort of parallel piece is around culture, because unless we address culture fundamentally, then this stuff will continue. Women and girls will continue being abused. Domestic violence will continue to be the most prevalent form of VORG in the country, and that is something we feel that the government could be doing more on. So, for example, it's still not yet mandatory for those within the criminal justice system, be they judges or magistrates or the police, to have mandatory training on VORG and domestic abuse. And until we begin to shift the culture and shift the priority and make it the expectation, we will continue to see the things that we're seeing with regards to the culture being permissive.
So Farah's just brought up culture, and in my introductory remarks, I mentioned Everyone's Invited, which is highlighting and trying to end culture of sexual harassment and misogyny in schools. Just yesterday, The Guardian published an anonymous account of a young woman who moved to an all-girls school to escape what she described as a rape culture at her previous mixed-sex school. Alexandra, and perhaps if I get your thoughts after that, Yvonne, what do those issues faced by young people tell us about the future?
I think we're seeing two things happen at the same time here. I think we are seeing a really dangerous escalation in online hatred against women, and an incel culture, which, albeit seen as a kind of minority problem, is still a really big part of people's lives, and worryingly could be growing. So I feel like girls these days not only face misogyny in the structures of their daily lives, but also there's no escape from it when they go home, when they're online. Then they're also facing abuse. But I also think there's more people are speaking out and reporting sexual assault, and more people are calling out sexual harassment. My hope is that it's not getting much worse year by year. It certainly feels like it is, but my hope is that this problem, I think, is an intractable one. It's always been here, and there is a sense now that women and girls, particularly young women, are just not going to stand for it anymore. And I do think there is a kind of uprising, and we've seen since the murder of Sarah Everard, women really finding their voices, taking to the streets and protesting in a much more vocal way. We need to see more of that, because a lot has to change for women and girls to feel safe in this country.
Thank you, Alexandra. Yeah, Yvonne, can we get your thoughts? Do you agree there's no escape from misogyny? You're an advisor to women in prisons. Prison's a place where safety has to be so paramount. What are your thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't be sending quite a lot of women to prison in the first place, but I think this whole issue of violence against women and girls is so multifaceted, and I think culture is a really important thing. But what are we actually telling young men and boys when it comes to relationship education, for example? There's very little research that shows what works and what doesn't work. There is a feeling of a kind of glimmering of hope with bystander culture, you know, where you're encouraging young men to stand up and speak out. But there's no real investment in it. And I think part of the problem is we always place the onus on women and young and girls to do the active work, the direct action. I agree with Lexi that direct action is really important, but it's not their problem. It's not their problem. It's a masculine problem. It's a problem there where I don't even think if you actually asked the average young man for a definition of misogyny, I think they'd be really confused. And I understand why they're confused, because women inevitably in this kind of society send mixed messages. But unless we actually start using words that people understand, that we're not going to actually achieve as much change as we need to. The other problem we have is that GPs will tell you that if they have a young man coming to them who says, I'm really worried, I'm watching too much pornography, or I think I'm becoming too violent to my girlfriend, there's very little in the way of help for them. I mean, we have a dearth. We have, 400,000 known serious perpetrators. And I think about 1% of them will find something to help them, to encourage them to stop. So this is such a multifaceted problem. And it needs a large overall interconnected strategy that actually within that has accountability. So if you don't do your job, something happens. And it also has monitoring, because we don't know that every time there's a domestic homicide, there's a domestic homicide review, and they usually put out several, sometimes up to 20 recommendations. Nobody knows if they're actually implemented. So what is the point? It's Groundhog Day all the time, and I think that's what has to stop.
Thank you, Yvonne. I mean, Priti Patel has spoken about not leaving men and boys out of the conversation, and London Mayor Sadiq Khan has recently launched a video billboard campaign that targets men in an effort to address pervasive misogynistic attitudes and reduce male violence against women. Maria, what do you think about the approach that the mayor is taking? Is it the right one?
Look, I think whatever approach we take, we need to be tackling it head on, as Yvonne has just suggested, because we have, I think, in this country an ingrained culture of cover up about this issue. When I was chairing the select committee, we did 5 reports on sexual harassment because it permeates every single aspect of women's lives. We need to make sure that it is addressed in schools, in workplaces, in society more broadly, as well as the internet that I was talking about earlier on. One thing this government has done, which previous governments didn't do for 17 years, as a result of possibly having a small majority under the Theresa May government, we put in place sex and relationship education as a mandatory for all school-age children. And the initial fuss about that died down very quickly when people realized that 5-year-olds did need to understand what a healthy relationship looked like. However, Ofsted have been extremely slow in putting that change in the law into practice, and I, for one, will be keeping a careful watch on what they're doing. And the everyone's invited debacle should never have happened if Ofsted had actually done what they should have done, which is implement a change in their evaluation framework at once. And the fact that they were investigating that, I think, was a curious choice by the Department for Education. So as well as looking at school culture, we have to look at more broadly access to pornography. Yes, we will be prohibiting children from accessing pornography in the way that they are at the moment, and this is extreme pornography often, but we need to look more carefully at the way in which pornography is fueling some of what Alexandra was talking about in terms of the escalation of hate against women, and certainly it had a significant role to play in the murder of Sarah Everard. And the final thing I will put on the table of this much broader look at things is the use of non-disclosure agreements to cover up the sort of behaviour in the workplace, which going back to what you were saying was, is now absolutely unacceptable for many women, and women are able to talk out about it, but not if they've been slapped with an NDA or a confidentiality clause. So I think if you're trying to look for a good approach for tackling this, it comes from many different fields, and a lot of it does require legislation.
Thank you, Maria. Alexandra, the issues we've been discussing do require a real shift in how men and boys think about and relate with women. We've been talking about society-wide joined-up strategies, and this relates to a question we've received from an audience member, Hugo. Thank you for your question, Hugo, which I'd like to put to you. What role does the media play in initiating that change, being part of it?
I think the media has a really huge role to play. I've been heartened in the last 12 months that stuff that I have been writing about for a decade, and sometimes, you know, felt like I've been shouting into the dark. Many people are now A, listening to, and B, also writing about it in other newspapers where it's not been traditionally covered. I think the challenge will be now to maintain that focus as we go further away from, you know, the murder of Sarah, but also the murder of Sabrina Nessa and the treatment of Nicole Smolin and Beaver Henry. Those were all such shocking incidents that it gave a focal point for both the media to address these issues, and I think for wider society to pick up on them and talk about them. So I definitely think the media has a role to play. At The Guardian, we're very committed to writing about these issues. We have been for a long time and will continue to be. But I'm really glad to see that is also a commitment that seems to be echoed across other publications and people's online presence. You know, the media reflect what their readers want to read. So if people are talking about these things online, if they are writing about them on Facebook, on Twitter, on their social media, and if they are reading the stories that we are publishing, then we'll continue. You know, media houses with more commercial interests than The Guardian will continue to have to write them.
Thank you, Alexandra. Farah, Yvonne was talking about educating men and boys, ending bystander culture, but also about perpetrators. What do you think? More funding for perpetrator schemes? Should that be a government priority?
I think more funding for a whole system approach is what's needed. It's not a silver bullet, and sometimes I do find myself getting quite nervous when governments, or indeed any agency, default to actually we need to do more perpetrator schemes, because it feels like a silver bullet. It feels like that's what you do, and actually you can get quite far, and that's not the truth at all. You know, perpetrators are complex because society is complex. Yeah, we need to address the whole, and it's symbiotic with supporting victims, survivors. Unless you support victim survivors, you won't get justice, and you won't send the message to perpetrators that it's not tolerated in society. If you make the system too difficult for any survivor to seek justice, then perpetrators will continue to perpetrate. That said, I think Yvonne is absolutely right. There are lots of programs out there. I mean, we run one ourselves called Make a Change, and we work with Respect, a great organization, to develop that program. And what it tries to do is intervene at a very early stage, where you have got that perpetrator or that partner, that sort of survivor, if you like, saying, look, there is a problem here. And it takes that sort of family, that couple, that perpetrator, individually and together through a set of stages. And the idea is you begin to address that before you get to the really serious consequences, before you have to involve statutory interventions. So there are mechanisms out there. It's about, you know, I guess government choosing that it wants to invest in these interventions, it wants to invest in perpetrator programs, but it also wants to invest in supporting survivors. If a survivor's mental health, for example, is suffering, she's not going to want to invest and be part of a perpetrator program, because these things are hard and grueling. You have to have a whole system set of support mechanisms in place. And ditto, you know, I think sex education and the introduction of that's been really important and has really gone a long way. But still, if you look at a lot of those programs, and perhaps that's in their delivery, not in the intent, they're very much currently about the mechanisms of a relationship without the rule book. And what we want to ensure that schools are absolutely delivering the rule book. You know, what is a healthy relationship? How do you call out something that's not healthy? How do you judge when something isn't healthy? And how do you support, and how do you refer? So I think there's very much something there about prevention in schools early, to augment what's happening already through the programme that Maria mentioned.
Thank you, Farah. So you were speaking about, in some ways, the way that the system isn't working. One symptom of that might be female homelessness, which relates to a question we've gotten from audience member Samuel. Thank you for your question, Samuel. And I'll give this to Yvonne. So Samuel says that the number of people in temporary accommodation has been steadily rising for a decade. And in London, 2/3 of those people are women, many of whom are there due to relationship breakdown, leaving prison, escaping abusive partners. Is the government doing enough to address homelessness among women who are victims of violence?
Well, the government isn't doing enough to address housing, full stop. So, you know, it's a domino, it's a chain reaction. I think the real issue is, why are we asking the women and children to leave? Why are we still having very traditional responses to a problem that we now know really well inside out? It would be much better, as they're doing in some parts of Europe and in some parts of the States, where that the man leaves and the man has a tag. So if he comes, for instance, this happens in France, if he comes within a certain distance of the woman, that tag goes off and the police have to react. And I really wanted to introduce the whole issue of the police, because that's, again, a fundamental problem. The training of police, the recruitment of police, the training of police, the monitoring of police, and the lack of accountability of what police do, and the fact that they still are really focused on physical abuse and not all the other manifestations of abuse, which include economic and psychological and coercive control. So even the risk, the way that they assess risk, it fails to see the process. It's still looking for the visible bruises and the one-off incident. And I think all that has to change, you know, if we're really going to get any headway.
Thank you, Yvonne. Farah, would you like to come in on that?
Thank you. I think that's right. I think we are in an unfortunate position where the pressure is put on the woman to leave. However, I also think that in the current context, to have the man leave and leave the woman in the current in the accommodation that they're in, their family home, if you like, simply won't work, because the systems around it are just not good enough. You know, you don't get the criminal justice system isn't fast enough, the police are not responsive enough, the health systems are not responsive enough, the financial systems around the woman are not responsive enough. So currently, where that's trialed and where that's attempted, you often find it ending in frankly disaster, because the systems are not yet there. So if we can work towards a place where the systems are absolutely robust, and we can do that, I think that would be a great settlement. However, until we're there, and that will take a bit of a journey given where we are at now, we are in a place where refuge is, by large, the only option for a woman and children to seek safety and to seek refuge. That needs to be the aspiration, but there is so much there that needs to happen before that is truly safe for a woman. Because, you know, I mean, you often find perpetrators visiting the house and the police, you know, choose not to come, or they deprioritize it. And you know, that is terrifying for a woman and children and her children. And you have to remember that at that point where a woman leaves an abusive partner, that is the point at which she's in the most danger. So unless those systems are working well, that remains a dangerous option, even though we would like that to be the option.
Thank you, Farah. Maria, Yvonne and Farah have brought up the police and institutional failings and how they've dealt with women who are victims of violence. Is women's trust in the police irreparably damaged for a generation? Or how do we actually get back from this?
Well, I think it's clear that the police understand that not only the case of Sarah Everard, but all of the other instances that you outlined in your introduction have had a devastating effect on public trust in the police. And I don't think it's only amongst women. Kit Malthouse, who's the policing minister, has acknowledged that, and that there is an important job to do to rebuild the trust of the police. And the Angelini inquiry will be an important part of trying to understand how we rebuild that trust. They'll be particularly looking at the way in which Wayne Couzens' behaviour, who obviously was the perpetrator who murdered Sarah Everard, how his behaviour was not picked up on, where the opportunities were missed. And I think it is an important case study, because the evidence that came out in the trial showed that the murder of Sarah was simply part of a pattern of events that had not been picked up on. Chronically worrying because he was a police officer, but also more widely that we need to understand that the role of behavior, mental health problems, the use of extreme pornography, how that can all build up to a pattern of behavior that should be better understood, and then measures put in place to deal with it. Police trust is low, but we need to understand that this is the very small minority of officers who are involved in these sorts of activities, that the leaders in the police force need to understand better how to respond to events so that they don't do more to undermine that trust, as was the case with the protests around Sarah Everard. So I think it's a very complex issue. There are signs that it is going to be dealt with, but I think it's going to take a long time for the police to simply understand what they've got to do, let alone do it.
Thank you, Maria.
Also, can I just add that I think it's also really important when we're talking about this in the round to not only talk about the police when we're talking about the justice system, but also to talk about the CPS and the changes that have to be made within the CPS in order for any prosecutions to go forward. I mean, we have seen, as Maria said, she's absolutely right. There's a decimation of the trust between the women and policing at this moment in time for very obvious reasons. But in the police, at least, Sarah Crew is now heading up, is the national police lead on rape. There is a VOG lead, and there is a domestic abuse lead on police, at least in the upper echelons of the police force. There is very much a recognition that things have to change, I think. Has that gone down to all layers of the police? I think not. And I think there's very much still an attitude of covering things up and minimising crimes that are carried out by police officers. My view is that we do need a Macpherson-style report that has statutory powers into the police. I do think there is institutional sexism within the police, and that is something that has not been recognised. But those things also exist in the CPS. And because the CPS is an independent body, its work is much less well known than the work of the police who are at the coalface of this. I think it's really important that we, also focus on what the CPS are doing. And, just in rape, for example, we all know about the decimation of rape cases in this country. In 2016, 3,671 rapists were prosecuted, and in 2020-21, that was 1,972. So that's a huge fall, nearly 2,000 fewer rapists prosecuted, and that is a shame on our country. That should never have been allowed to happen, and it needs to change quickly. But it can't change without both the police and the CPS working together to make that happen. We had 88 more suspects charged last year. At that rate, it's going to take nearly 30 years to get back to 2016 levels of prosecutions.
Thank you, Alexandra. Maria, can I give you the last word here? Institutional sexism in the CPS. Do you agree? What's the way forward?
Well, I think the CPS, just like the police, have got questions to answer, and just for not only on issues around rape, but more generally in terms of the way they're dealing with crimes against women. I think every organisation in this country has to ask itself questions about how, whether there is institutionalised sexism at play. I sit here in the House of Commons, which I think has questions to answer in that respect as well. We need to make sure that this is a country where everybody can succeed regardless of their gender or their sex, and at the moment there are too many examples where that is not the case. So I wouldn't single out the CPS singularly in this respect, though I think it's an important point to make that their attitude towards charging, particularly around rapes, has not helped at all.
Thank you. Well, that is where we have to leave it today. Thank you very much to our panelists, Maria, Farah, Yvonne, and Alexandra, for their thoughts and time, and also to our audience for joining us today and sending in their questions. Goodbye, everyone.